Roman soldiers were partly paid in salt. The word salary comes from that practice, and the phrase worth one's salt is not a figure of speech. It was, for most of human history, a literal measure of a person's value. Wars were fought over salt. Empires were built on it. A tax on salt helped trigger the French Revolution. Gandhi walked 240 miles to collect it from the sea in deliberate defiance of British colonial law, and that walk changed the course of Indian independence. Today, you can buy a kilogram of salt for less than $1 and shake it over your food without a second thought, which makes it almost impossible to imagine what it once was. But for thousands of years, salt was one of the most precious and politically explosive substances on Earth, and the ocean, the largest repository of salt in the world, sat at the center of that story in ways that shaped the routes of trade, the locations of cities, and the fates of civilizations. The reason salt was so valuable is the reason the ocean is salty. Salt preserves food. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any modern method of keeping meat and fish from rotting, salt was the only reliable technology available for extending the life of perishable food beyond a few days. A fish salted immediately after being caught could last for months, long enough to be transported hundreds of miles from the coast to inland populations that had no other access to the nutritional density that seafood provides. Salt didn't just add flavor. It made civilization possible in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of a world with refrigerators. The ocean's connection to the history of salt is direct and fundamental. The ocean is the largest repository of dissolved salt on Earth, containing roughly 37 quintillion tons of it. But the ocean's salt, while vast, is not easily accessible for practical use. You can't drink seawater, and you can't use seawater directly to preserve food, because the concentration of salt in the water is diluted relative to what's needed for effective preservation. Extracting salt from seawater, concentrating it into a usable form, is the essential technological challenge that drives the history of salt production, and the various solutions that different cultures developed to that challenge are themselves a history of human ingenuity in the face of a fundamental biological need. This episode tells the story of salt from the ocean's perspective, tracing the role that seawater, coastal geography, and marine trade played in building the salt economies that shaped the ancient and medieval world. It also explores the chemistry of salt itself, why the ocean is salty, where that salt came from, and what it tells us about the geological history of the Earth. Salt is a simple molecule, sodium chloride, 2 atoms bonded together. But the story of how it got into the ocean, how humans learned to extract it, and how its extraction built and destroyed civilizations is anything but simple. Salt is also one of the few substances whose history connects the ocean, the land, and the human body at the most fundamental level. We need salt to live. The sodium in salt is essential for nerve function, muscle contraction, and maintaining the fluid balance of the body. The chloride is a component of stomach acid and plays a role in carbon dioxide transport in the blood. We lose salt through sweat and urine and must replace it continuously. In a hot climate, doing physical work, a person can lose several grams of salt per day through sweat alone. That biological need is the foundation on which the entire human history of salt is built. The history of salt is also, in a sense, the history of the ocean's relationship with human civilization. Coastal communities were the first to develop salt production at scale because they had the raw material at their doorstep. The trade routes that moved salt inland became some of the most important commercial arteries in the ancient world, and they shaped the locations of cities, the boundaries of states, and the outcomes of wars in ways that are still visible in the geography of the modern world. Understanding salt means understanding something fundamental about why the world is organized the way it is. The ocean's saltiness is not an accident, and it didn't happen overnight. It's the product of billions of years of geological processes that have continuously added dissolved minerals to the sea while simultaneously removing them through other mechanisms. The ocean has been salty for most of its history, but it hasn't always been as salty as it is today, and understanding how its salt content has changed over geological time is a window into the broader history of the Earth's chemistry. The primary source of the ocean's salt is rain. Rainwater is slightly acidic because it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as it falls, forming a weak carbonic acid. When this mildly acidic rain falls on rock and soil, it dissolves small amounts of the minerals in those rocks and carries them toward rivers, which then deliver those dissolved minerals to the ocean. Among the most common dissolved minerals in river water are sodium and chloride ions, the two components of common table salt. Over billions of years, with rivers continuously delivering dissolved sodium and chloride to the ocean, the concentration of these ions has built up to the roughly 3.5% salinity that characterizes modern seawater. But rivers also deliver other dissolved minerals to the ocean, including calcium, magnesium, and sulfate. If all of these minerals simply accumulated without being removed, the ocean would have a very different chemical composition from what it actually has. The reason the ocean's composition is relatively stable is that geological processes are continuously removing minerals from the water. Calcium, for example, is extracted from seawater by marine organisms that build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. When those organisms die and sink to the sea floor, their shells become part of the sedimentary rock record, effectively removing calcium from the ocean. Sodium and chloride are different from calcium in one important respect. They're much less reactive, and there are fewer efficient biological or chemical processes to remove them from the ocean once they're there. This relative chemical inertness is why sodium and chloride have accumulated over geological time to become the dominant dissolved ions in seawater. Other minerals cycle in and out of the ocean relatively quickly. Sodium and chloride just build up. There's also a contribution to the ocean's salt that comes not from rivers but from the ocean floor itself. Hydrothermal vents, where seawater circulates through cracks in the ocean crust and is heated by the magma below, leach additional minerals from the rock and release them into the ocean. Volcanic activity along mid-ocean ridges also releases dissolved minerals directly into the water. These geological inputs help explain why the ocean's chemical composition is slightly different from what you'd predict based on river inputs alone. The ocean's salinity has also varied over geological time in ways that matter for the history of life. During periods when seawater was locked up in inland seas and then evaporated, forming thick salt deposits, the salinity of the remaining ocean increased. During periods of heavy glaciation, when enormous amounts of fresh water were locked in ice sheets on land, the ocean salinity also increased because the same amount of salt was dissolved in a smaller volume of water. The geological record of salt deposits provides one of the tools scientists use to reconstruct the salinity history of ancient oceans. Each mass extinction, in this way, was also the ocean rewriting its own rulebook. Understanding why the ocean is salty also helps explain something that surprises many people. The ocean's salinity is remarkably stable over long timescales. Despite billions of years of rivers delivering dissolved minerals from the land, the ocean's salt concentration has stayed within a relatively narrow range. This stability is not accidental. It reflects a balance between the inputs and outputs of dissolved salts that has been maintained by geological and biological processes operating over geological time. The ocean is, in this sense, a remarkably self-regulating chemical system, one whose stability is itself a precondition for the evolution and maintenance of complex marine life. The first humans to produce salt deliberately were almost certainly coastal people who noticed what happened when seawater evaporated in shallow pools left behind by the tide. When seawater is confined in a shallow basin and exposed to sun and wind, the water evaporates and the dissolved salt is left behind as a white crystalline residue. This process, called solar evaporation, requires no technology beyond the ability to recognize what's happening and to manage the flow of seawater into and out of natural or constructed basins. It's likely that salt production by solar evaporation began independently in multiple coastal cultures around the world, because the basic phenomenon is visible to anyone living near a warm, sunny coast with access to shallow tidal areas. The earliest clear archaeological evidence for deliberate salt production dates to roughly 8,000 years ago in China, where pottery vessels used to boil seawater and extract salt have been found at sites near the coast. Boiling seawater is a less efficient method of extracting salt than solar evaporation because it requires fuel, but it works at higher latitudes where there isn't enough sun and heat to drive natural evaporation effectively. The development of both methods, solar evaporation in warmer climates and boiling in cooler ones, allowed salt production to spread far beyond the narrow band of warm, sunny coasts where natural evaporation was most practical. Rock salt, which forms when ancient inland seas evaporate and leave behind thick deposits of crystallized salt, was another major source. Some of the oldest salt mines in the world are located far from any modern coast, including Hallstatt in Austria and the Khaura mine in Pakistan. These sites were used continuously for thousands of years, and the Hallstatt salt mines are so old and so productive that they gave their name to an entire period of European prehistory, the Hallstatt culture of the early Iron Age. The miners who worked these sites left behind remarkable preserved artifacts because the dry, antiseptic environment of a salt mine is one of the best preserving environments on Earth. Coastal salt pans were developed to a high degree of sophistication in the Mediterranean world. The Romans operated extensive salt pans along the coast of Italy and across their empire, and the management of these facilities was a significant logistical and engineering undertaking. The pans had to be designed to control the flow of seawater in stages, progressively concentrating the brine as it moved from basin to basin, because salt crystals of different purity precipitate out at different concentrations of brine. Getting the process right required both practical knowledge of the chemistry involved and considerable engineering skill. The geography of salt production shaped the development of early cities in ways that are still visible in place names. Cities whose names include the syllable sal or hall, both of which mean salt in various ancient languages, are often located at historical salt production sites or on important salt trade routes. Salzburg in Austria, whose name literally means salt fortress, was built to control a major salt trade route through the Alps. Halle in Germany takes its name from salt production that operated there for thousands of years. The salt map of Europe reads like a map of the ancient commercial world. The production of salt was, almost everywhere it occurred, a labour-intensive and politically significant activity. Because salt was essential, and because its production required specific geographic conditions, salt producers and salt merchants occupied a position of considerable economic power. Whoever controlled access to salt controlled something that everyone needed, and the political consequences of that control shaped civilizations in ways that resonate through the entire history of the ancient world. Salt routes were among the first long-distance trade routes in human history, and they shaped the geography of the ancient world in ways that are still visible today. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the oldest roads in Italy, running from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River inland to the Apennine communities that had no local salt source. It predated the Roman Empire by centuries and was in continuous use for more than 1,000 years. Many of the roads that Romans later paved and extended followed earlier paths that had originally been worn into the landscape by the movement of salt. In Africa, the trans-Saharan salt trade was one of the most economically significant commercial systems of the medieval world. The Sahara contains enormous deposits of rock salt, formed when ancient seas evaporated millions of years ago. And these deposits were the foundation of a trade network that connected sub-Saharan West Africa to the Mediterranean world across thousands of miles of desert. The most famous of the salt-producing centres was Timbuktu, which sat at the junction of the Saharan salt trade routes and the Niger River trade system that connected it to the gold fields of West Africa. At the height of the Mali and Songhai empires, the exchange of Saharan salt for West African gold was so regular and so valuable that contemporary accounts describe it as a trade of equal weight. In China, salt was a state monopoly for most of recorded history, a policy that generated an enormous and consistent revenue stream for successive imperial governments. The Chinese salt monopoly system involved the government controlling the production, distribution, and sale of salt, granting licenses to merchants who paid for the right to sell salt within specific territories. The system was both a source of imperial revenue and a source of constant corruption, as the profits available from smuggling salt attracted criminals and occasionally sparked major rebellions. The Hanseatic League, the commercial alliance of North Sea and Baltic, trading cities that dominated northern European trade in the medieval period, was built substantially on the trade in saltfish. Cod, herring, and other fish caught in the North Sea and the Baltic could only be transported and sold across the distances required by Hanseatic merchants if they were preserved in salt. The availability of suitable salt was therefore a fundamental constraint on the entire Hanseatic commercial system. When salt sources became unavailable or too expensive, the herring fisheries and the trade they supported collapsed. Salt also played a central role in the settlement patterns of the Americas before and after European contact. Indigenous cultures across North and South America developed salt production techniques adapted to local conditions, from the solar salt pans of coastal communities to the processing of salt-rich springs and mineral deposits inland. When European colonizers arrived, they quickly identified the existing salt production systems and either incorporated them or disrupted them, depending on whether those systems were compatible with colonial commercial interests. The economics of the salt trade also drove early financial innovation. Salt trading in China gave rise to some of the earliest forms of paper money, when merchants began using certificates representing salt deposits as a medium of exchange rather than physically moving the salt itself. Han Dynasty salt certificates of the 2nd century BCE are among the earliest documented uses of paper as a financial instrument. The connection between salt, trade, and financial innovation is a reminder that the history of money is often a history of commodities, and that the commodities driving the earliest financial systems were often those most essential to survival. Salt also played a central role in the settlement patterns of the Americas before and after European contact. Indigenous cultures across North and South America developed salt production techniques adapted to local conditions, from the solar salt pans of coastal communities to the processing of salt-rich springs and mineral deposits inland. When European colonizers arrived, they quickly identified the existing salt production systems and either incorporated them or disrupted them, depending on whether those systems were compatible with colonial commercial interests. The relationship between salt and fish is one of the most important partnerships in the history of food, and it shaped the development of coastal economies and ocean exploration more directly than almost any other commercial relationship. Salt cod, which was produced by heavily salting dried codfish from the North Atlantic and could be stored for years without refrigeration, was the first truly global food commodity. It was produced off the coasts of Newfoundland and Iceland, processed in ports from Portugal to Norway, and consumed across Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean. The codfish trade was, by some measures, the foundation of the Atlantic economy. The Basque people of the border region between Spain and France were among the earliest and most skilled practitioners of the salt cod trade. Basque fishermen were crossing the North Atlantic to fish the cod-rich waters of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland as early as the 14th century, possibly earlier, and they developed a salt cod processing method so effective that it gave them a dominant position in the European fish trade for centuries. The Basques kept their fishing grounds secret for as long as they could, because the combination of access to excellent cod fishing and access to Bay of Biscay salt was the foundation of a commercial advantage they had no interest in sharing. In the Mediterranean, a product called garum was one of the defining flavours of the Roman world. Garum was a fermented fish sauce produced by salting small fish, typically anchovies, and allowing them to ferment in the sun for weeks or months until the proteins broke down into a pungent, intensely savoury liquid. The sauce was then bottled in the distinctive ceramic amphorae that have been found in archaeological sites across the Roman Empire and shipped to markets throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. It was, in essence, the ketchup of the ancient world, added to everything from meat to vegetables to wine. Salt herring was the other great preserved fish product of the pre-modern world, and the history of the herring fisheries of the North Sea is inseparable from the history of salt trade in Northern Europe. The Dutch developed a technique called gibbing, which involved removing the herring's gills and part of its gut immediately after catching it and packing it in salt in barrels that significantly improved the quality and shelf life of the preserved fish. Dutch salt herring became one of the most valuable trade goods of the medieval Baltic economy and helped fund Dutch commercial expansion of the 16th and 17th centuries. The geography of early European exploration of the Americas follows, to a remarkable degree, the geography of the cod and salt trade. The salt fish trade also had consequences for ocean ecology not recognized at the time. The extraordinary cod abundance that made the Grand Banks fishery so productive was a feature of an ocean under minimal human fishing pressure. As the cod trade expanded, fishing pressure increased dramatically and cod populations began to decline. The collapse of the Grand Banks fishery in 1992, when Canada declared a moratorium because the population had fallen below 1% of its historic level, was the end point of a process the medieval saltfish trade had set in motion. Salt made fish tradable over long distances. Long-distance trade made intensive fishing economically viable. Intensive fishing eventually destroyed the resource. The connection between salt and ocean exploration runs deeper than simply providing food for sailors on long voyages. The search for cod, herring, and other preservable fish drove exploration of the North Atlantic, and the need for salt to process those fish drove the development of trade relationships between fishing communities and salt-producing regions that spanned the entire North Atlantic world. The geography of early European exploration of the Americas follows, to a remarkable degree, the geography of the cod and salt trade. Salt was so valuable for so long that it inevitably became an instrument of political control, and the history of salt taxation is a history of some of the most hated and destabilizing fiscal policies in the human record. The gabelle, the French salt tax, is perhaps the most notorious example. It was introduced in the 14th century and persisted, with various modifications, until the French Revolution. At its most severe, the gabelle required every French person above the age of 8 to purchase a minimum quantity of salt per year at a price set by the state, regardless of whether they needed or could afford it. The penalty for smuggling or tax evasion was severe, including galley slavery for repeat offenders. The social consequences of the gabelle were substantial and contributed meaningfully to the resentments that eventually produced the French Revolution. The tax was applied unevenly across different regions of France, with some provinces paying dramatically higher prices than neighbouring regions, which created a powerful incentive for smuggling across internal borders. By the late 18th century, it's estimated that roughly 3,000 people per year were being condemned to hard labour or worse for salt-related offences in France alone. The gabelle was one of the first taxes abolished by the revolutionary government in 1789, and its abolition was greeted with genuine popular celebration. In India, the British colonial government's control of the salt trade was one of the most visible manifestations of colonial economic exploitation. The British taxed salt heavily and prohibited Indians from producing their own salt from the sea, forcing them to buy imported salt at inflated prices. Mahatma Gandhi's decision in 1930 to make salt the central issue of a civil disobedience campaign was a stroke of political genius. The Salt March, in which Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the sea to collect salt in deliberate violation of British law, became one of the most iconic acts of political protest in the 20th century. It was simple, peaceful, impossible to misunderstand, and demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of the colonial salt policy to an international audience. Chinese salt monopolies generated repeated rebellions throughout imperial history. The most consequential was led by Huang Chao in the late 9th century. Huang Chao began as a salt smuggler who had failed the imperial civil service examinations and turned to the illegal trade as an alternative. He eventually led a rebellion that swept across China, sacked the capital city of Chang'an, and contributed to the collapse of the Tang dynasty, one of the great periods of Chinese civilization. The salt trade and the resentments generated by state control of it had brought down an empire. The connection between salt taxation and political instability runs through the histories of multiple civilizations and across multiple centuries. Salt taxes were easy to collect because salt was essential and its production was geographically concentrated. But they were also inherently regressive, falling most heavily on the poor, who spent the highest proportion of their income on basic necessities. The combination of universal necessity, concentrated production, and regressive taxation made salt one of the most politically explosive commodities in history, a substance whose control could fund a government and whose mismanagement could bring it down. The history of salt taxation also illustrates something enduring about the relationship between essential commodities and political power. Control the thing everyone needs, and you control the people who need it. The connection between salt taxation and political instability runs through the histories of multiple civilizations and across multiple centuries. Salt taxes were easy to collect because salt was essential and its production was geographically concentrated. But they were also inherently regressive, falling most heavily on the poor, who spent the highest proportion of their income on basic necessities. The combination of universal necessity, concentrated production, and regressive taxation made salt one of the most politically explosive commodities in history, a substance whose control could fund a government and whose mismanagement could bring it down. The Industrial Revolution transformed the economics of salt in ways that eventually made it cheap enough to strip it of its political significance. By the 19th century, advances in mining technology allowed rock salt to be extracted from underground deposits at scales previously impossible. The discovery of vast salt deposits in locations including Cheshire in England, the Great Lakes region of North America, and locations across Central Europe dramatically increased the global supply and drove prices down. The development of railway networks allowed this cheap salt to be distributed far from its source at costs that were a fraction of what earlier land transport would have required. The collapse of salt's value as a commodity had cascading effects on the industries that had depended on it. The salt cod trade, which had been one of the foundations of the Atlantic economy for centuries, declined as refrigeration began to make fresh and frozen fish available year-round. Salt continued to be used in food preservation on an industrial scale, but it was no longer the only option, and the strategic value that had made it a state monopoly and a source of wars faded as alternative preservation technologies became available. What replaced the food preservation role of salt as the driver of its economic importance was industrial chemistry. In the 19th and 20th centuries, salt became the primary raw material for the production of chlorine and sodium hydroxide, two chemicals that are fundamental to a vast range of industrial processes. Chlorine is used in water purification, paper bleaching, and the production of a wide range of plastics and solvents. Sodium hydroxide, also called caustic soda or lye, is used in paper production, textile manufacturing, and the processing of aluminum. The chemical industry that grew from salt processing became one of the largest and most economically significant industries in the world. The modern salt industry bears almost no resemblance to the ancient salt pans and boiling operations that produced it for most of history. Most of the world's salt is now produced either by solution mining, in which water is pumped into underground salt deposits to dissolve the salt and then pumped back out as brine, or by open-pit mining of rock salt deposits. Solar evaporation salt pans still operate in tropical and subtropical regions, but they're increasingly mechanized and managed at scales that would have been unimaginable to the workers who raked salt from medieval salt pans by hand. That transformation is partly a story of technology, partly a story of the discovery of new sources, and partly a story of how completely the conditions that made something valuable can change when the problem it solved is solved by other means. The chemistry of salt also connects its industrial uses back to the ocean in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The chlorine produced from salt by the chlor-alkali process is the same element that is added to drinking water supplies around the world to make them safe. The disinfecting power of chlorine, derived ultimately from the same sodium chloride that the ocean contains in abundance, is one of the most important public health technologies in history. Chlorinated water supplies are estimated to have saved hundreds of millions of lives by preventing waterborne diseases, and the salt that enabled this is derived from the same geological processes that make the ocean salty. Salt's transformation from a precious commodity to an industrial raw material is one of the most complete economic reversals in history. A substance that once funded empires, inspired revolutions, and drove ocean exploration is now so cheap that it's used to de-ice roads in winter, dumped onto highways in quantities measured in millions of tons. That transformation is partly a story of technology, partly a story of the discovery of new sources, and partly a story of how completely the conditions that made something valuable can change when the problem it solved is solved by other means. The ocean's salt is not simply a passive backdrop to the human history of salt production and trade. It plays an active and essential role in the physical and biological systems that make the ocean work. The saltiness of the ocean, measured as salinity, is one of the two primary variables, along with temperature, that determine the density of seawater. And it's the differences in density between water masses at different temperatures and salinities that drive the global ocean circulation system that distributes heat around the planet. The thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the ocean conveyor belt, is driven by the sinking of cold, salty water in the polar regions. When ocean water cools near the poles, it becomes denser and sinks toward the ocean floor. As it sinks, it draws surface water from warmer regions toward the poles to replace it, creating the surface currents that carry warm water from the tropics toward high latitudes. The salt in seawater plays a critical role in this system because salty water is denser than fresh water at the same temperature, and it's the density of polar water, both cold and salty, that provides the driving force for the sinking that powers the entire circulation. This circulation has profound implications for the climate of the regions it touches. The North Atlantic current carries enormous amounts of heat from the tropical Atlantic northward toward Europe and the Arctic. Without this heat transport, the climate of northwestern Europe would be dramatically colder than it actually is. London sits at roughly the same latitude as Calgary in Canada, but it has a dramatically milder climate because the ocean circulation is delivering tropical warmth to its doorstep. The saltiness of the ocean is one of the reasons that's possible. Changes in the ocean's salinity can disrupt this circulation with significant consequences for regional and global climate. One of the concerns associated with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is that the fresh water released by melting ice would dilute the salty North Atlantic water, reducing its density and potentially slowing or disrupting the thermohaline circulation. A slowdown in this circulation would reduce the amount of heat delivered to northwestern Europe and could cause significant regional cooling even as global average temperatures rise. This is one of the more counterintuitive potential consequences of global warming. Salt also plays a critical role in ocean biology. Most marine organisms are adapted to the specific salinity of the ocean environment they live in, and changes in salinity stress or kill them. Estuaries, where freshwater rivers mix with salt water, are among the most biologically productive environments on Earth, partly because they create salinity gradients that support a wide variety of organisms adapted to different conditions, and partly because the nutrient-rich fresh water mixing with the salt water creates ideal conditions for primary productivity. The role of salt in ocean biology extends to the functioning of the human body in marine environments in ways that sailors know from experience. Drinking seawater, rather than hydrating you, actually accelerates dehydration because the kidneys must excrete more water than they take in to eliminate the excess salt. This is why people stranded at sea without fresh water can die of thirst surrounded by water. The irony that the ocean, which is the source of most of the world's salt and which makes salt production possible, is itself undrinkable because of its salt content, is one of the more profound examples of a resource that is simultaneously essential and inaccessible. Salt consumption today is dramatically higher than it was for most of human history, not because we value it more, but because it's now so cheap and so ubiquitous that it finds its way into almost everything we eat. Processed food, in particular, relies heavily on salt, both for preservation and for flavour. And the result is that the average person in a developed country consumes roughly 10 grams of salt per day, roughly twice the amount recommended by health authorities as a safe maximum. The public health consequences of this overconsumption are substantial, with excess salt intake linked to high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. The environmental consequences of the modern salt industry are also worth noting. The production of salt by solar evaporation, while ancient in its basic technology, can have significant impacts on coastal ecosystems when practiced at industrial scale. Large salt pans transform coastal habitats, eliminating the mangroves, mudflats, and shallow water areas that support marine and bird life. Solution mining of underground salt deposits can cause land subsidence as the underground salt is removed, and the brine, produced as a byproduct of various salt production processes, if discharged back into the ocean, can create local areas of elevated salinity that affect marine communities in the discharge zone. There's also a peculiar irony in the relationship between the ocean salt and the modern freshwater crisis. The ocean contains an essentially unlimited supply of salt water, and the technology to remove the salt from that water, desalination, is well established and increasingly efficient. Desalination plants already supply a significant portion of the drinking water in water-scarce regions like the Arabian Peninsula and parts of Australia. But desalination is expensive and energy-intensive, and it produces a highly concentrated brine as a byproduct that has to be disposed of somewhere. The story of salt also illustrates something broader about the relationship between natural resources and civilization. Salt was once so scarce relative to demand that it organized trade routes, funded empires, and generated wars. It's now so abundant relative to demand that its main uses are industrial and it's spread on roads in winter. That transformation happened not because the resource itself changed, but because technology changed the supply. The same pattern can be seen in the histories of other resources, from whale oil replaced by petroleum to timber replaced by steel and concrete. What the ocean's salt ultimately teaches us, looked at across the full sweep of human history, is that what we value and what we need are not always the same thing. Salt was valued because it was needed. When the need was met by other means, the value collapsed. The ocean has always had the same amount of salt in it. What changed was our relationship to that salt, our technology for using it, and the alternatives available to us. That pattern of value being determined by scarcity and scarcity being determined by technology and knowledge is one of the most fundamental dynamics in economic history. The ocean's perspective on the history of salt is, in the end, the most interesting one. From the ocean's point of view, the salt has always been there, slowly accumulating over billions of years through the patient work of rivers dissolving rock and carrying minerals to the sea. Human civilizations discovered it, fought over it, built economies on it, and eventually figured out how to make it cheap enough that they could afford to spread it on roads. The ocean watched all of this with the equanimity that comes from operating on geological timescales. Its salt will still be there long after the last human empire that taxed it has fallen and been forgotten. Salt is the ocean's oldest gift to civilization and its most taken for granted. For most of human history, it was worth fighting over, taxing, smuggling, and building empires around. Today, it sits forgotten in shakers on every table. The ocean hasn't changed. We have. In our next episode, we follow the Polynesian navigators, the greatest ocean voyagers in human history, who crossed the largest ocean on Earth in canoes using nothing but stars, wind, and wave patterns to find islands thousands of miles away. Until then, thank you for listening.